So we shall start. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to you all. Welcome, of course, to representatives from the media. Welcome to our institutional partners and to our members for the presentation of the result of the 27th edition of our Facts and Figures. And as you know, and as we keep repeating, Eurospace facts and figures are actually very important information for the sector. Of course, for the industry to know where it stands, but especially for the institution, because for a sector which depends roughly on 70% on public procurements, our very basic message to decision maker is base your policies on the reality. And this is why today Pierre will also introduce the global economic situation of the space sector. European institutions should, of course, benchmark their ambition with regard to what happens in other space powers. So many thanks to all the industries, members as well as non-members of Eurospace, which made this new edition possible. It's a relatively small step to fill Pierre's Excel tables, but it's a giant leap for the understanding of the sector. Of course, today is a very special day. The entire sector is delighted with last night's good news regarding Ariane 6, which should give us collective confidence. But we should not bury our heads in the sand. The economic situation in the sector, unfortunately, has deteriorated significantly. So the challenge today is to determine with our institutional partners and institutional customers how to react, because what is at stake is not only the space sector sustainability and profitability, it's actually the collective effort that urgently needs to be made to maintain the capabilities that Europe collectively needs. Because with every company that downsizes, Europe risks losing key capabilities that can take ages to rebuild. So now fasten your seatbelts and take off with Pierre for your annual journey to space economics. Pierre, you have the floor. Thank you very much already for all the works that allowed this new edition to happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Thank you for all the participants which have registered today. We have a bit more than 40 participants in the call. So yes, indeed, I am very pleased this year again to share with you the main findings of the facts and figures survey that we produce every year. And as you know now, this has been for us an occasion to actually share with you a number of findings about the global economic situation of the space sector. So I will go through the presentation. The full presentation deck will be available for download from our website as soon as the end of this presentation. So it's around 4 o'clock. So let me start by sharing the presentation with you. This will be rather articulate. So yes, I'm sharing PowerPoint, very good. So what will be in the presentation today? So we will start with an overview of the general context. This will include some macroscopic trends in space infrastructure markets. Then we will have a more detailed look at what is the situation with institutional programs. And then we will have a look at what is happening in commercial programs. After that, I will be sharing with you our own analysis of the European space budgets. We do a focus on that because, as you may know, space business is very much associated to public spending. This is true worldwide. And this public spending is very much targeting domestic supply only, which is why at Eurospace, we focus a lot of attention to actually measuring those European space budgets and understanding what are the trends behind that. So we will share the consolidated figure for 2023, and then we will look at what have been the recent trends towards this situation in 2023. And only after that, we will actually reveal the main findings of the annual Eurospace Facts and Figures survey. We will share, of course, with you the key data. We will review the employment by segment. We will review also the sales by segment. And then at the very end, I will share with you also a new analysis that we are promoting this year, which is an overview by a type of company segment. This is a brand new thing. You will see interesting trends over there. I will be stopping for questions at the end of each chapter. So if you want to bring something to the discussion or want to deepen your understanding of any specific element that we have seen here, of course, you will have a chance to do so. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll also open the floor for more general questions and comments. So clearly, this is not related to the major successful event that we have witnessed yesterday night. We're very happy with it and the successful IN6 launch. It's a big relief for the sector. You will see that this hopefully will enable us to modify a little bit the upcoming trends, especially for the European space businesses. So let's move along and let's have a look at the global context figures. So all the data that you will be seeing here is actually sourced from the Eurospace markets database that we call the LEAT, the Launch Events Analysis Tool. This is all done completely internally and not relying on any external consultant or actual data acquisition. So this is all sourced with us. At Eurospace, we collect launch activity with a lot of details. And what I would like to share with you first is the difference in market metrics. There are many, many ways to measure the business of a space. And when we say the business of space, basically it's everything that is actually launched to orbit, because if you're not putting something in orbit, if you're not deploying space infrastructure, then it's not space business. And here you see three very different ways to actually measure what is happening and what has been launched in orbit. The first simplest way to measure things is actually looking at the total number of satellites being launched. And this is an interesting measure in absolute terms, but it has a number of limitations. And then the second way to measure it is what you see in the middle. You can actually accumulate the mass and measure the mass which is actually deployed in space. And as you can see, it is not telling really the same story. And then you can actually refine a bit more the analysis, and you can turn that mass and numbers into what we call market opportunity, which is the price paid by the customers to actually deploy those satellites in orbit. And as you can see, satellite count is not an efficient market metric, and this is because you are lining up things which are very different. It would be, if I would take an analogy, like measuring vehicles and counting one by one skateboards together with cars, buses, and trucks. Clearly, it's interesting to have the total number of four-wheel vehicles, including skateboards, but then it's more interesting also to look at the importance of those vehicles. And this is what we do with the mass at launch. When we accumulate mass at launch, we get already a better feeling of what is actually happening in space infrastructure. But then when you add the value of the satellites launched, and you realize that government programs are actually much more expensive and ambitious in all terms, in terms of performance, efficiency, global innovation, etc. Clearly, you have another very important metric for the industry, which is actually involved in producing, developing, and launching those satellites, because this is how the value and the number translates into actual market opportunities. So we do believe that in many, many cases, it is very important to look at this market opportunity, and we have developed a specific model within Eurospace to actually produce this. So let's have a look at the main trends already. So on the first chart on the left, you can see the total spacecraft mass which has been launched, organized by customer region. So it is the customer for the satellite and the launch year. And here we would like to highlight one key trend which has been really accelerating in recent years. The total mass deployed to space is actually growing very significantly since 2020. And we have now achieved every year a new record in total mass launched. And here we will see later on, the totality of this effect is actually driven by one single player, which is SpaceX with the Starlink constellation. On the second chart in the middle, you can actually see how this mass at launch translates into market opportunity for people which are building the satellites. And here you see that clearly this market opportunity is growing very slightly in recent years, but definitely not as much as the mass which has been deployed. And the reason for that is that those Starlink satellites, which are making most of the mass, admittedly, they are super cheap to produce, so they don't represent the big market opportunity. This is why we see that the market value is not growing in any very significant way. It is growing a little bit, and we will see exactly what are the trends behind that. And on the right-hand chart, you see our assessment of the launch market, which has been associated to deploying all that mass in orbit. And here you see that clearly there has been a little bit of growth in terms of market value for deploying all this very big mass. But again, this growth in value is not proportional to the amazing growth in mass. And then again here, the main reason is that those Starlink deployments are really done very much on the cheap side of things. And despite, the very big number of those launchers, if we have to assume that the SpaceX declarations about the low cost of launch, the low cost of the satellites are true, which we are doing in this presentation, then of course the market opportunity is not very big. So a few key messages here. We have global launch activity very much in growth. 95% of the growth we have seen in the past 3 years is actually driven by one single event, which is the Starlink deployment. We see that the global spacecraft market value is in the order of $30 to $60 billion a year. This is the total market opportunity for the people which are building operational satellites that go to orbit. It's not the total value which is available to the space industry worldwide, because this figure does not include all the spending from the various space agencies to support research, development, and innovation programs. So this is on the side. It's probably a 20, 30, maybe 40 billion on top of that. Again, if we look at this space infrastructure market, we see that the US and China customers represent 70% of the total value. And we will see later on that most of that value is driven by government programs. So it's government funded. When we look at the launch market value, we see that it sits between $9 and $13 billion a year. And here again, we see exactly the same trends as with the infrastructure, the satellite market, where US and China customers, they represent about 70% of the total demand. So here we see the basic, very high level macro trends. I would like to show how those macro trends are actually translated when we put Starlink, which, as I said, is a unique phenomenon. If we put it on the side, we can actually see the massive growth of mass in launch, which is associated to the Starlink deployment. Again, this is a very unique feat, and it has never happened before in the history of space flight. It's really amazing. But then when we look on the side, everything which is happening apart SpaceX is really not showing any major paradigm change. And actually, if you look at the level of growth which we have witnessed in the past 10 years, basically most of the growth, and I will detail that further, is actually driven by the Chinese investment in space, which is growing, and basically nothing else than that. So basically we have two major trends in growth in space program. One, which is among us in terms of mass, which is the mass deployed for Starlink, and the other one, which is mostly related to the stepping up of the Chinese space programs. Everything else, to some extent, is not really changing. So let's have a look at the institutional programs themselves. So here we have two basic charts which are presenting the mass deployed to Earth by main program here. So we see this on the left. So we identify that we have a lot of space applications which are actually associated to government funding. The biggest of all is actually about human space flight. And then you see that telecommunication systems in orange are important as well, remote sensing, and GNSS. You can see that science programs, which includes non-human exploration activities and also astronomy, astrophysics, etc., they're still very much limited in terms of total mass and importance. Even if those programs can be quite expensive in the end, they can represent a very interesting business opportunity, but it's still not very important. Most of the activity is actually associated to human space flight. And to some extent, the second growth point we have seen is about remote sensing programs. And those remote sensing programs have been really very much fueling the growth. And as we will see, looking at the slide on the right, is that most of that growth is also translating into more investment in military programs. And what we see in the chart on the left, on the right, excuse me, is that civil activity is very much the main drive in terms of mass deployed to orbit for institutional programs. But military programs, they represent between 25 and 35% of the mass, depending on the year considered and they remain a very important player in space. And actually, if you remove from the civil program mass the amount which is associated to human spaceflight, which is a very specific area of activity, clearly you see that military spending is actually very much the key point and the key growth item today in terms of business opportunity associated to institutional space programs. And in fact, in this chart, we present separately by customer country the civil space program in mass, excluding human space flight, and the military space programs in mass, excluding human space flight. And so we have basically comparison points. And you can see very clearly that in terms of civil institutional programs, the trend today is decreasing. Less mass is launched in space on behalf of civil satellite institutional programs, again, not counting human space flight activity. And on the contrary, you can see that the interest and the investment towards military space programs is actually growing. And one of the main items behind that growth is what I call the Chinese catch-up effort. China is the blue bars at the bottom. And clearly we have seen in the past 20 years that China has been stepping up its investment in space. It has been engaging in space geopolitics, and it is growing very significantly its reach towards space programs, embracing civil activities, human space flight, but also a significant investment in military space programs. So those are very interesting trends. They're not necessarily very well advertised elsewhere, but again, key message, we believe that civil institutional programs are decreasing in importance, with the exceptions of human spaceflight, which are very much being on a growth trend recently. And on the contrary, we believe that military institutional programs in space are the main growth factor in institutional programs. And this explains why Europe is still a bit lagging behind. Now, when we translate the same charts from mass to actual business opportunity, we are invited to understand another very critical phenomenon, which is that military space programs, being more or less the same size as the civil space programs, human space flight excluded, but they represent a much more sizable business opportunity than what is actually happening in civilian space programs. And here we see that clearly military programs, they do provide a way larger business opportunity, about 2.5, all things equal considered, 2.5 more than civil programs. This is one of the key features of military space programs for the past decades. They really call up for the most advanced technology. They add a lot of requirements which are not there for civil programs. So there is a good reason why those business opportunities are much bigger. But then again, it is really something that needs to be considered. And when you look at the most basic difference between the civilian assessment on the left and the military assessment on the right, I believe that there are two things which are really worth considering. The first one is the overwhelming importance of the deep blue bars, which represent the US effort, and then the very significant growth of the lighter blue bars, which are at the bottom, which represent the Chinese investment. So this is a very important feature that I want people to keep in mind. And then here we also see the orange bars, which are really very, very small, because Europe is definitely not a big player in military space. On the contrary, in Europe, military spending in space is very much lower than in all other space powers, and in particular compared to China and the USA, which are really leading the game there. Another interesting consequence of this situation with institutional program is what we show on this chart here, where basically we identified the total launch demand in $1 million associated to institutional missions organized by program origin. So we have Chinese programs on the left, European programs on the Russian programs in the middle, and the US programs on the right. And here already you see the difference in scale of the actual launch demand, which is associated to those institutional programs. And one of the reasons why we focus very specifically on that demand is that this is very much a demand which is, as much as possible, considered captive by the customers. So Chinese institutional programs will be deployed in priority by Chinese launchers. And this will be the same for the US programs, for the Russian programs, and European programs. All those space powers have a very strict policy to promote the use of domestic launch capacity whenever possible. Of course, in Europe, in the past few years, we were left without the full capacity to actually deploy our own programs. So we've been resorting to other launch services. But this has not been the case in China and the USA. So those markets are very much captive. And then you have to see that the size is very much different. Today, the US and Chinese launch demand represent on each side a market opportunity for launch service provider, which is in the order of $2 to $3 billion a year in terms of purchasing power and market value. So this is a very sizable amount, which enables the deployment of an important supply base, and including having duplication of capabilities and the choice in launch. On the contrary, the European launch demand for the institutional program is less than $300 million a year, which is a very small market. And it represents a bit less than 4 launches a year. So clearly in Europe, we are faced with a market situation associated to our institutional programs, which is completely different than the ones we have in China and the USA, which means that our launcher policy, our launcher strategy cannot mimic the one of those countries because they do not apply to the same metrics. This is something very important. One of the reasons also why we don't have as much launch demand as the US and the Chinese, well, the first reason is that because we don't have a sizable military program that generates, in both USA and China, about 30% of the demand that they have. But the other reason is that we don't pursue either an independent human spaceflight program, which again is another sizable element of the institutional launch demand in both USA and China, because human space programs, they require for deployment activities, crew rotation, and cargo service between 4 and 8 launches a year by space stations. So that's really a sizable amount of demand, which is a baseline that promotes good business for local domestic launch service suppliers, which are actually capable of addressing that specific demand. So before moving to the key trends in commercial program, maybe I will quickly open the floor for any question on this first part, which is dealing with institutional demand, institutional markets, if there is any question from the... So please raise your hand and I will make sure that I see that. So apparently this was crystal clear. So let me move to the second part of this global context where we look at the commercial program. So just to point on the definition, we call a commercial program at Eurospace exclusively the programs in which the satellites are procured by a private entity. So this is a very narrow definition, but it's interesting because basically it looks at the actual business cases of those companies which have actually been driven by private capital only. So here you see 2 main metrics: the number of spacecraft which have been launched on behalf of commercial programs. And again, as before, we have put Starlink on the side. And clearly, if you look at the number of satellites, you see that there is a trend in growth. There are more and more satellites which are launched on behalf of commercial programs. And this has actually been one of the elements which have actually promoted the narrative that the commercial space is growing. And indeed, commercial space is growing, but I would rather say that Starlink is growing, because if you look at the mass chart, which is the one on the right, you can see that if we look at the mass deployed on behalf of commercial programs, we don't see really a growth beyond Starlink. What we see is that basically some private operators that were probably procuring less satellite, but bigger ones, are now procuring more satellites, but smaller ones. And in the end, the total mass at launch is not increasing in any visible and significant way, and at least not in any way proportional to the actual growth that we have seen in spacecraft numbers. So there is growth in number of spacecraft, but beyond Starlink, there is not much incremental activity registered in recent years on behalf of commercial space programs. Again, this is very much counterintuitive because everyone has been mentioning that there has been major growth in terms of commercial space these years. We don't see this translating into measurable data set. Here we see those same trends in terms of business opportunities. So you are manufacturing satellites on the left. This is the market opportunity you would have from commercial demand. And if you are in the launch business on the right, this is the market opportunity that this commercial demand will actually generate for you. And here again, we see two major things coming out of the analysis. The first is that clearly in terms of business opportunity for building satellites, of course, the demand from Starlink doesn't exist because it is fully internalized by SpaceX. And but you realize that the total value of this SpaceX CapEx is not that big eventually. And you look at the rest of the market opportunity offered by commercial programs here, looking at the type of customers. So we see the European customers, which are very big in orange, but clearly you see that overall, the commercial opportunity offered by satellite programs for commercial customers is not that big. And indeed, it has been spiking up those two last years, 2022 and 2023. But we don't see here a change in paradigm and a change in value. And globally, this market opportunity for commercial satellite is sitting between 2 and 5 billion every year. And this is the total amount which is available to commercial competition. And this same market opportunity represents between 1.3, 1.4, sometimes even less, and up to $2.2 billion in terms of launch market demand. So clearly what we see here is that the commercial demand for satellite and the commercial demand for launch is only a very small fraction of the total global demand for space systems and launch services worldwide. And this again is due to the fact that those commercial services, those commercial satellites are actually priced way below institutional programs. So in terms of spacecraft market, Starlink business is a very low one in proportion to mass. And Starlink launch today is the #1 commercial launch market segment. Just keeping in mind that for this chart, we have valued every Starlink launch at what we believe is the market price. If it was valued at the company cost, which is only a fraction of the market price for the Falcon 9, it would probably be 50% less than the figure we show here. Again, we use the market pricing for consistency reasons. Here we have a look at a very specific segment of the commercial program, which is the geostationary satellite segment. For years, this has been the only segment of a commercial spacecraft. And the satellites in geostationary orbit operated by companies such as Eutelsat, Inmarsat, SES, and the others, they actually represented for ages the meat and bones of the commercial market. And here we see on the left-hand side, the trend in mass launched to GEO for commercial applications. And on the right-hand side, you see a very similar curve, which is actually estimating the market value in $1 billion of deploying that architecture and that infrastructure in space. And clearly, what we see is that the GEO commercial demand is very much decreasing. It was in average about 3 billion a year in the decade 2004-2013. It is in average less than 2 billion a year in the next decade, the 2014-2023 decade. So clearly, this is a major trend affecting the sector. There are a number of key reasons behind that. The first one is the lower demand for actually using those satellites in orbit. So we see that the main customers for those satellite services, which were the TV broadcasting companies, are actually buying less and less. They have been displaced by the streaming operators such as Netflix and the others. So there is less demand for premium TV distributed by satellite. And then the other reason for this decrease is that the Ka/Ku band service for broadband internet access using geostationary satellite is not providing the same and expected revenue opportunities that people were actually planning a few years ago. One of the reasons behind that is also the rollout of the Starlink service, which is capturing a lot of that specific demand. So I'm done with the overview of the global context. I would like now to move to the European budgets review. Then again, I'm briefly opening the floor for questions, if any. Very good. We see that we have a very... Il y a une question? Iris Square is not launched yet, so it is not happening in the analysis yet. But when we will have Iris Square flying and going, it will be an institutional program, and we would probably classify it as a military program because by type of application, it's more on that category. Yes, we do have data for LEO, but for the time being, the commercial market in LEO is very limited. So we gave a focus on, I believe that you are referring to this chart here, where we actually focused the interest on commercial GEO programs. But yes, indeed, we could separate LEO from that, but that would not represent a big business opportunity so far. So let's move now to the overview of European space budgets. One of the reasons why we actually focus a lot of our attention on this is that those budgets, they eventually represent a lot of the business opportunity for European space companies. And of course, the members of Eurospace have a very strong interest in monitoring those budgets. So this is why we focus our attention on them. So we have an analysis which is actually using two different representation. The first one is we take a look at the actual budget by source. From the political point of view, it's interesting to understand that a lot of space spending in Europe is actually driven by decisions taken at national level. So there is a national decision to allocate a certain amount of budget to space activity. And then this is eventually allocated to a different type of implementing agencies. But there is also a European Union specific mechanism that enables to create a specific portion of the European space budget, which is not driven by national policy and national consideration, but is a decision made at the level of the European Union, involving the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament. The basic difference between those two procedures and those two processes, beyond the size, of course, the national space budgets are much bigger than the EU space budget, but the main difference is that in the national space budget, the decision is really made at national level to invest and flag some budget for space activities, while for the EU space budget, this is a collective decision and which is less tinged by national policy concerns and drivers. So in our analysis, we found that in 2023, there were 8.8 billion that were made available from national space budget to actually support investment in institutional space programs in Europe, and then about 2 billion euro that were made available from the European Union space budgets. Excuse me. My apologies. And the total is about 11 billion in 2023. So this is the actual amount that was available for spending on European space programs in 2023, driven and derived by institutional investment in space. And this is focusing exclusively on what we call the upstream part of the budget, which means that the additional money is also made available from national and European Union programs to actually fund market development and downstream activities. Those are not counted in this figure. We are really focusing on the money which would be available to actually invest to deploy satellite infrastructure. And on the right-hand side, we describe how this budget is eventually spent, and more specifically by whom. And we see that out of the 11 billion, almost 7 billion are eventually managed through the European Space Agency, which is the #1 technical agency to support the actual implementation of European space programs. And so ESA is managing a lot of the budgets which have been driven by national space policies. So a lot of that, actually the biggest part of that is invested in ESA, but also ESA is managing a lot of budget on behalf of the European Union. So this is why eventually ESA in 2023 had a budget of about 6.9 billion to be managed and to spend on institutional space programs. And then we see that the second spending point is actually managed by national civil entities. So there we see that a few big space agencies like the French Space Agency, the German Space Agency, and to a lesser extent the Italian Space Agency, they also have significant programs with a national focus. And I will take that question as soon as I'm done with the presentation on this chart. And so almost 2 billion were actually channeled through those variety of national programs. As I said, most of that money is spent in Italy, France, and Germany. And then we see also that there is almost 1.4 billion, which is managed by national entities, but on behalf of military programs. And here we have programs such as Skynet or SATCOM-BW or Athena-Fidus, and those kind of programs, which are really very much national programs with a military purpose. We see that EUMETSAT is also managing around 400 million on those space budgets, and eventually the EU is only managing a small amount of their total commitment to space programs, because most of the money that the EU is spending in space is eventually managed by ESA. So I saw that there was a question coming up. Let me open up the chat panel and let's have a see. The question goes, hello, could you clarify whether the national space budgets refer to ESA member states or to EU member states? Well, most of those national space budgets are indeed associated to ESA member states, but you see very small amounts invested by some member states which are not in ESA, and you see very big amounts which are invested by member states which are ESA member states but not EU member states, such as the UK or Switzerland or Norway. So I hope this is actually answering the question. You're welcome. So let's move to the next slide. So here we see a dynamic presentation of the sources. What we see here is that clearly European investment in space has been on a growth trend. This trend can be somehow a little bit misleading. I will not spend too much time explaining the technicalities of why this is misleading, but what we measure every year is the total amount which is available for spending in the given year. But what you should know is that this amount, particularly within the European Space Agency, includes the leftovers from the previous year, which are not spent in the year, so they're made available for the next year. So clearly, when the budget is growing from year to year, you never know precisely how much of that growth is organic, which is associated to more investment in the year, and how much of that growth is actually a leftover from the previous year, which accumulates on top. Still, we see that there is a growth trend that we believe is also supported by organic growth. and we see that most of the growth trend is actually driven by investment from the national space sectors. I see that there was a question also coming up, so let me open the chat again. Have you counted the funding at national level or from EU to the countries in support of the recovery plan with the COVID? Yes, so we've included all the funding from the recovery plans in our analysis, of course. We have seen that this has been very much implemented through national agencies, but not only. We see that some of the spending in Italy from the recovery plan is actually being implemented through ESA. This is the case, for instance, of the EDD program funded by the Italian recovery plan. We have seen also that the Spanish recovery plan is also focusing on a lot of money, which is eventually spent through ESA, because Spain has put in their recovery plan the totality of their investment in the European Space Agency. So yes, we try to give that. And of course, all the money from the recovery plan in our analysis is in the blue line. It's national space budget money. Here we see the same trend. Again, I will not spend too much time in this, but clearly you see that the growth trend we see from the sources side translates eventually in more money being channeled through ESA. And this has been one of the major points of growth in recent years. But with this growth, we see that a lot of the growth is not organic. And you may have heard a while ago, because it was leaking in the press, that the president of the French Space Agency was complaining that ESA was not spending quick enough the money that was provided to it for the implementation of the program. So there is a lot of budget which isn't spent sitting into the ESA treasury account. And this also explains why this budget managed by ESA is growing every year. A significant share of that growth is not actually organic growth. It is money which is carried over from year to year because it was not spent properly in the year where it was available. There are many, many reasons for that. Financial reason, administrative reason, but also programmatic and technical reason. It would be beyond the focus of this specific presentation to actually go through that, but it's an interesting subject, and ESA is tackling it at the moment. Here we see the split of the budget by country. So as you can see from the list here, what we call Europe in our analysis is the addition of all EU countries plus all ESA countries. And here you see that there are a few big players in the European space. And the top three players, France, Germany, and Italy, represent alone 66% of the total funds invested in institutional space programs. So those are clearly forces to reckon with. The top five, they represent 81%, and the top 10, 91%. Clearly, very big concentration here, and a lot of very, very small players in European space. Sometimes I wonder how difficult it can be to manage at ESA level the contribution from very, very small contributors, such as Latvia or Cyprus, and those very, very small players. For me, sometimes I wonder how administratively good it's that to actually have those very, very low contribution. We have a comment here. We have a comment from the Director of Earth Observation of ESA, Simonetta Kelly, which is actually letting us know that, let me reopen the chat, I saw it briefly coming up, that ESA has managed to spend, I think there was a little typo here, Simonetta, you put 1,005%, I think it was 105% in Earth observation in 2023 and fulfilled these plans. So clearly, yes, indeed, I didn't want to go into the details, but not all directorates are concerned the same way by the underspending of the budget. So we are happy to see that you are here.
There is a general issue in the agency, but you have to also to differentiate between domains at some point on this and also on the spending.
Yes, thank you for this clarification. Also, I would like to insist on this point. This question of the budget unspent is a complex question. And the reason I mention it is that when we see this budget growth, we need to understand the difference between organic growth and actual budget availability. And this impact of this leftover budget is blurring a little bit the analysis. But again, we know that this is not an easy thing to do, to actually implement and roll out the full spending, especially since a lot of member states as we have seen, are stepping up their game in ESA. So there is more investment coming in. So it's a challenge for the administration to actually spend everything fast enough. So thank you for the comment, anyhow. Appreciate very much this interaction. So let me move now, but maybe I will open the floor again for any question or comment on this European space budget analysis before I move to the actual results of the facts and figures survey. Une question? C'est dans le chat. So we have a question in the chat. No? Je comprends pas. No? Okay. So apparently there are no questions. I was trying to understand Olivier was. Okay. So let's move now to the results of the survey. So all the data which I presented to you before is actually data that we source from public sources, and we compile and we organize it in our own way, especially the market information and the budget information. For the facts and figures survey, it's a different thing. We have developed in 1996 a questionnaire that we actually sent to the main companies in the European space sector and the European space sector. And this questionnaire is actually completed and returned to us, and it goes into building up an economic model, which enables us to produce what we believe is a consistent measure of the revenues and employment associated to space manufacturing activities in Europe. And very much of that is coming from the questionnaires. Today we have economic model, which is 550 companies in the model. And we have today been able to update 260 units in that model in the year, thanks to the returns and the actual data sourcing that we do to produce the economic model every year. And overall, the return we have on the questionnaires we send is about 47%. But the good news is that the returns we have is focusing on the bigger players. So we have a good outturn in terms of representativeness. We have 83% of the data in terms of final sales that we measure, which is actually sourced from the survey itself. And then in terms of employment, there is 75% of the actual data that we use in the survey, which has been updated this year, thanks to the questionnaires that have been returned. So my gratitude goes to the people who take the time to complete our questionnaire form, which is pretty detailed and discloses a lot of information on the companies. Of course, you should keep in mind that we are filling the gaps for about 17%, for about 25% of the employment data, meaning that we use what we call proxies, which are there in the model to ensure that we keep the perimeter complete while we work. And for those proxies, we are about 17% in terms of estimate for the final sales. Overall, we believe that the measure we do provides a stabilized assessment of the global European space activity every year. We have registered in 2023 a very limited growth of sales, about 8.4 billion, and a massive growth in employment. One of the key points I wanted to raise, and I will go into more details at that at the end, is that one of the results of this decrease in sales value and the actual growth of employment is that we see that the average apparent worker productivity is actually decreasing, which will eventually generate a number of economic and financial problems in the sector. So this is very important to keep in mind. I will have a focus on that at the end of the presentation. It's a bit technical, but interesting. Question, is this level of productivity per worker absolute or adjusted by inflation? It's not adjusted by inflation. We do not have a good measure to adjust global inflation for the space sector, because using just simple inflation is not accurate enough from our perspective. So everything is in current economic conditions. So if you put on top of that the actual loss of value associated to the inflation, especially in recent years, obviously the real productivity is falling even more. So this is our main chart, where you see in blue the final sales, which have actually been growing for quite a while, since 2005. They reached a top value around 2016, 2019 at 8.5, 8.7 billion euro. Then there has been a major drop here in 2020. This is the COVID year, where a lot of activities were slowed down and industry was not able to invoice as much as they used to do. After that, we have regained the level of revenue, more or less, that we had before the COVID, but we still see a slight decreasing trend. And moreover, we have never regained this almost 1 billion euro that was not paid in the year of the COVID. So this is also probably some money which is left unspent in the ESA treasury, but not all of it. This is clearly something which has been one specific event and which has not been compensated. We see also that there is employment. We see that the growth of employment is actually accelerating, despite the fact that revenue has been stagnating, slightly decreasing since now 2016. And clearly here, the reason is driven by two main events. One is that there is a lot of commitments taken by the industry. So the sales are not super good and not in growth, but we see that the order book, generally speaking, is growing, especially in the key established players. So this generates employment requirements from these guys, but we will also see that there is a lot of growth in the new emerging space sector in Europe. So overall, we have reached a record value of 62,700 employees, which are direct employees in the European space industry, which is really a very big figure. In the early 90s, we were around 35. So you see, we have really been almost doubling up the employment value. Here we see some industry company demographics. So on this chart, we have three basic information. You see first in the histograms that the distribution of companies across Europe is uneven, and it reflects very much the distribution of funding of European institutional programs. So we see three main industrial sectors: France, Germany, and Italy. And then we see other lesser players, but significant ones, such as Spain and the UK, a bit Belgium as well, and the Netherlands. So clearly here you have the big seven in the European space industry. And another interesting metric that we have elaborated is we are able to split those employment by type of companies. So you can see that what we call the large four, which are basically the employees of the subsidiaries of the four main aerospace and defense industrial groups in Europe, which are Airbus, Thales, Leonardo, and Safran. Those four big groups, they actually represent today 51% of the total employment in the industrial space, in the space industry in Europe. And those large four, through their subsidiaries, are also very well represented in national employment, such as in France, where they represent 70% of the total employment, in Germany about 50%, in Italy about 60%. So they really represent the core of the industry. But of course, we actually see mid-caps, which represent 25% of total employment, and we will see that this is actually a point which is in growth. And then SMEs in yellow, representing 6%, and then the startups. I will go into more detail on the evolution of those segments. And on the right-hand side here, we see at the level of the corporate membership of Eurospace, the key players in the sector. So every company member of Eurospace, which has more than 1,000 employees in the space industry, they get featured in this chart here. And you see that the bigger one, of course, is Airbus Defence and Space, whose space employees represent 20% of the total employment today. But then we have Thales Alenia Space, Ariane Group, OHB, Telespazio, GMV, Safran. And when we say Safran here, we look at the space business unit of Safran, because Safran, as you know, is one of the major shareholders of Ariane Group, but this is just the specifics of Safran. Avio and Beyond Gravity are the companies representing 41% of the total. So this is, Stefan, how do you count employees for agency? We don't. They're not included in those figures. We should ask the agencies to count the employment in the agencies. So employment trends by company type. This is a chart that we have started producing last year because it was interesting to look at the specific dynamics of those different segments of industry. And you can see here that we have the total employment in Europe organized by those main categories. So we see the large four, Airbus, Thales, Safran, and Leonardo. The other large groups, the mid-cap category, which is all those independent companies which have less than 10,000 employees in total, not especially in space. The SMEs, of course, with the EU definition, and the startups, which are newer emerging industrial players. Most of them are also SMEs, but not all of them. Some have outgrown the SME status. And clearly here we see, I believe, three very interesting trends. The first one is that we see that some categories are growing fast. The large four, the mid-cap, and the startups. Actually, the startups are growing faster than anyone else, but the growth in the large four and the mid-caps, I believe, is an interesting trend to have a look at. Clearly, the other large groups, which include companies such as Air Liquide, for instance, are not taking advantage of this, are not promoting this growth in employment to the same extent as the other three groups have been mentioning. Those historic SMEs, which are very much involved in the supply chain, also are not growing very, very fast. But globally, employment is growing in every segment of the industrial sector. So this is a very, very good news for the sector. On the other hand, it can be slightly preoccupying. I will explain why later on. Here, just a small shameless auto-promotion plug, but this is just showing you the representativeness of Eurospace members in the total figures. So you can see on the left-hand side how representative we are in the various groups. So clearly the large four are very well represented with Eurospace, the mid-caps as well. On the other hand, as a big player organization, we are not very good in attracting SMEs and startups, but I'm extending the invitation to anybody interested, but we now have specific membership schemes which are more attractive, financially speaking, for SMEs and startups. So contact us if you want to join the association. And you can see here, this is exactly the same on the right-hand side. You see that we are very representative country by country with very, very few exceptions. So we are a strong, well-organized and representative organization. Here we look at the trend in sales. So this is another chart that we produce for a while now, where we basically identify, as I did, in the initial part, in the global context, we separate European institutional programs and the revenue opportunity they represent for the industry. So those are actual sales towards those institutional programs. And then we have commercial and export sales, which are on a different trend. So about institutional programs, clearly we see that there has been a growth trend. So basically the industry is making more revenues from these institutional programs. There was this big drop, as I mentioned before, in 2020 due to the COVID. It's a technical thing, but clearly this has been recouped so far. And we have seen that institutional program revenue was actually on a growth trend since 2003 now, which is a very satisfying point, and which goes also in line with our analysis of the European space budgets, which are actually growing as well. So this is a key point. On the other hand, when we look at commercial and export sales, we see that it has been a very cyclical thing at the very beginning. So we had a very high in the year 2000 and then dropping again and then growing again slightly. And now it is receding. Clearly, since 2017, we have lost 1 billion in business on the commercial and export segment. And this has been a very serious worrying point for the sector. Clearly, we need to find, at this point in time, some solution to compensate that loss, because, as I said before, we do not expect this commercial market to grow significantly in coming years. Again, most of that market was associated to the geostationary commercial segment, and today this is not poised to grow in any significant way. So this is a subject of concern. Another element which is included in this commercial business is actually the business of producing operational launchers. And as you know, the operations at Arianespace in recent years have really slowed down. We are very happy to have validated Ariane 6 now. So most probably in the next year, we will see this point increase again. But for this, the market, the launcher needs to find its market. I see that there is a question popping up. Let me open the chat again. So there are two. Do you have the same graph as the Eurospace FTE? No, we don't have personnel by type of market because this information is not available from the industry. So that's something we cannot do. And then there is another question. If you would compensate with inflation this line, then there would be a decline of the industry sales. Yes and no. We have tried it once. The problem is that this inflation marker is good for the salaries and those kind of things. But if you start looking at the actual industrial costs, it's not really representative. So I wouldn't go into that today. It's a very complex point from the economic point of view. So yes, it's difficult to say. What is sure is that if you add inflation, you will reduce the trends anyhow. But again, I don't think that the inflation values are really very much relevant to apply to space industry products. This is why I'm always reluctant to actually do that. Working in current economic condition also has interests. So this is the other chart with those long series where we now have more than 30 years in perspective. And here you see the business split by major product lines. So we have satellite application systems, which includes everything with telecom, observation, and navigation. And this has been really the main point of sales. It has really grown significantly since the early 90s. And this is where you see in a very basic way how big space applications have become in the public eye. It's really a major change because if you look then at all the other product segments, including launcher in the orange curve or scientific systems in gray and support and other activities, which are actually in yellow and blue, you can see that major change has only happened in terms of satellite application systems. So we are doing more in commercial telecommunications, we are doing more in Earth observation, and we are doing more in navigation. For all the rest, we are looking at rather stable business environments over the years. So this is really something interesting to look at. The other thing which is interesting to consider in this chart is looking at the recent trends in satellite applications, which are really going down. And again, as I said, the same trend we see in the launcher system revenues, which are also going down. So if you wonder why business is going down in recent years, don't look further than satellite applications. And this is where most of the commercial business is happening. And of course, the launcher business, which has been really slowing down with the delays in Ariane 6 and the slow rate of launch in Kourou, which have been the major driver behind that curve. And then, as I said, I wanted to put a small focus before I close up this presentation on what I call the segment dynamics. So I presented at the beginning a chart where I was putting on the side the large groups and then the mid caps and the SMEs and the startups. And it's interesting to look at those specific groups separately. So here you see the total sales. So we have what we call the final sales in blue, which are the sales to European institutional customers, and then the sales to European commercial customers in slightly deeper blue, and then the commercial and export sales, the rest of the world customers. And then on top of that, we have the yellow part, which is what we call the intersector sales. This is what we eliminate when we want to assess final sales because they include a lot of business, which would then be counted twice, 3 times, or even 4 times. So for the consolidation purpose, we eliminate. But here we look at the total value of the business between those groups. So you see that globally, those large groups, including the large four and all the other, they have a total sales which are slightly receding in recent years. There was this big drop in 2020, but clearly you see that in those large groups, the business overall seems to be on a receding trend, with the exception of their sales to final institutional customers in Europe, which have been rather stabilized. It's interesting also to put the total sales evolution in perspective with the actual employment, which has been in growth. And then, of course, if you divide the total sales with the number of employees, you get the average worker productivity. And here you see that for those large groups, productivity is quite high at 242,000 euro per worker. And I believe that this is driven mostly by the fact that this includes also the business of integrators. So into their total sales, they have a lot of elements which have been procured to lower tier providers. So it's interesting to keep this in mind. Those large groups, they are facing a trend of decreasing business, generally speaking, but they're still hiring more and more to face their commitments for the medium and long term. Here we see the evolution profile of the mid-caps, and clearly here you see that the trend has been quite significantly in the growth area. You see that the business structure is a bit different, even if they also have a lot of business in final sales directly with European institutional customers, and they have been improving the situation quite significantly. They're reaching a worker productivity, an average one, which is above 200,000 euros. So every worker in this segment of the mid-caps is actually producing 200,000 euro of sales, which is, I believe, an amount which enables to support growth, investment, and a balanced business. Here we see the situation with the SMEs. As you can see, the SMEs have much more business in what we call the intersector sales, meaning they are working lower in the value chain. They are providing equipment and component to the mid-caps and to the large groups, but not only. And what we see is that they have been growing their employment quite significantly in the past 10 years. And we see that this growth has really been molded to the growth of total sales, which makes a lot of sense. They have a lower average worker productivity. That's basically because they don't go as high as the other players in the value chain. And so this is what they actually produced. And I believe that most of that will be added value. So they have also an economic environment which enables them to keep the lights on and to pay the salaries at the end of the year. And what is most striking is when we look today, we look at the startups that we have started monitoring since this phenomenon grew. So those startup companies, they have a specific realities that they have yet to mature a business. Most of them don't have an operational product to sell yet. And they have been growingly supported by a number of R&D programs and grants from the European Space Agency. I can mention the BOOST program, for instance, or the CSTS program or the Scale-Up program. So there are a lot of programs now that are providing those startups with specific revenues, which are not really service acquisition, but they're grants. So they come into the revenue. And what we see here is that clearly those startups are also associating employment growth with business improvement, and which makes a lot of sense. But the key point for me is that today they still have an average worker productivity, which is beyond sustainable, 54,000 euro per company in average. It is not enough. So this is clearly what I believe is still a point of concern. We need to have for those companies a viable business case. And they need now to actually step up their game, mature their products, and find their customers so that they can actually play in the game of those space markets on a par with the others, and with sufficient gains per employee that would generate potentially balance in the bottom line and a good business sustainable in the end. So this is the last words I wanted to make. In terms of conclusion, let me recall a few important facts. Now, yes, there was this last chart. This is showing actually the evolution of the apparent worker productivity. And as you can see, it is not really evolving a lot, except that for the big players now, it is going a little bit down in the end, which is probably a subject of concern. So again, we have the full data at the end. My few words of conclusions here. So let's recall that we are in an environment where the space business is very much driven by anticipation on commercial development, but this anticipation, which has been very, very strong in the past 10 years, still doesn't really translate into business opportunity accessible for the major players and for players around the world. We have seen that in this commercial space, everything that happened was associated to Starlink and SpaceX, but all the rest, we are still in the promise department and not yet in the realization. So we need to monitor that closely. On the other hand, we see a lot of interest on institutional programs, and we see that globally speaking, the US and China are really stepping up their game, and we see that at a lower scale in Europe, we have growth in European public investment in space. So this is an area of satisfaction for the European space sector. And we are very much worried that the commercial market, the established one, the one that was really providing a good business for the European space sector, so those geostationary satellite operators, which were really buying a lot of our satellites and a lot of launch services, we're really wondering what would be the future for them. We have seen some consolidation. We have the SES Intelsat. We have the Viasat Inmarsat merger. We have O3b, which is now an SES company. We have OneWeb, which is now a Eutelsat company. So a lot of things are happening in that sector. But history is telling us that when customers consolidate, eventually they save on capex and investment. So I am not very positive on the fact that this consolidation of players on the demand side will actually be generating more business for the industry. So I'm done with this presentation. I thank you all very much for your attention so far. The floor is open for any question and discussion you would like to have.
Yeah.
There is a question from Erlikid. Do you want to turn your microphone and voice it, please? Erlikid, is there?
Yes, sure. I was wondering if these last evolution profiles, you make them only from the data you got from the questionnaires, or if you based them on other sources as well?
So there is what I presented from the questionnaire, but of course we do a lot of business intelligence as much as we can. So of course we look at forecast, and in particular I've been looking very closely at the capital expenditures of those satellite operators. And when you look at the capex projections, which are produced by a few specialized investment banks, what we see is that the level of spending that you could see on the large four, so SES, Eutelsat, Inmarsat, and EchoStar, those large four, they used to spend between 700 and 1 billion a year on global capex. And what you see now is that this capex is driving down and the level is more around 500. So clearly the positioning on the commercial market that we see is not letting us project any significant growth from those specific players.
Thank you.
Mark Vallès has raised a hand.
Yes, thanks, Pierre, for the clarity of the support and the deepness of the comments. You raised the fact that with the last set of slides, that there is maybe to take into account in the institutional programs, the part of the research and technology. Can you give some comments for the other sectors of industry? What is the part of the, let's say, support, kind of R&D support with respect to the kind of services activities from the institution? Do you see a change in it in the last years, or or is it?
No, well, so the R&D support in Europe is what we will see, for instance, in specific programs at the level of ESA, such as the GSTP, RTS, FLPP, ELIPS, etc. Globally speaking, at the European Space Agency level, those programs, they may represent about 8% of the total budget. But this is not all. If you look at the specifics of a lot of programs, such as whatever the Copernicus program, you will see that there is a lot of R&D which is integrated in the cost of the program. So we have two different measures for that. First, we have the model we use for the market assessment, and there we try to eliminate this R&D share to actually focus only on the value of the space infrastructure deployed. And at global level, as I said at the beginning, we believe that for every dollar or euro which is eventually deployed in orbit for an operational system, there has been at least 50 cents in R&D, globally speaking. So, and I believe that this ratio that we can document when we look at the ESA spending, when we look at specific programs analyzed by the US Inspector General for both NRO and DoD and NASA programs, this ratio usually stands. So we take this as a stable assumption. In the Eurospace Facts and Figures survey, we cannot measure that because we don't separate this amount in the questionnaire. So we have no way of actually separating this. And I believe that the trend, generally speaking, goes together with the evolution of institutional funding. So if institutional funding grows, the R&D value and the money available for that for industry will also grow proportionally. But this is very difficult to document precisely, so we don't have a lot of insights.
Thanks for this clarification.
Merci. We have Serge Flammenbourg.
Yes, thank you, Pierre.
You're welcome.
It's very great, your presentation, as usual. I have a question related to application and services, dedicated to space data. Have you any idea or statistic coming from the complementary sector of the space infrastructure, which is Eurospace data, that would show also the increase or decrease of the services and application in SMEs or in a larger group using the space data for various applications, you know, be it in Earth observation or in navigation. There are a lot of new actors that are popping up now, okay? Using also that, I take one example, which is the obvious one as Copernicus data, but not the only one, there are others. Because there is a lever effect, what we see, there is a lever effect of space infrastructure to the downstream sector. So have you any evolution or data?
So we don't produce this data at Eurospace, and as people may know, I've been observing the reports which are produced on the downstream assessment by many players. So you have to look at the clients for those reports, such as the European Union, and then there is those multi-client studies, so that those consultancies, Nova Space, which is a new name of Euroconsult, or NSR, or Bryce Technology, they're all more or less producing those figures. My point is that those figures are not very much reliable, and that's because, as you point out, there must be a lever effect. So the idea is that I would be interested in knowing if more people are buying space data from your observation satellite, because that could be an indicator that I would be building more satellites. And I believe that this is the key point. The fact is that we see that those assessments are not actually trending towards justifying more satellites in orbit. So we have those very big European Union funded studies about the added value and the downstream value for observation and for Galileo. So yes, there's accumulation of figures, but I believe that they are very difficult to understand beyond the basic message is that everything is growing. So what we see is that maybe, yes, this added value in the downstream is growing, but does it translate into growing business opportunity for people building satellites? The answer is no. And if I look at the specific new players, there's quite a few in observation. For instance, you can see, you can have a look at the business of Planet, you can have a look at the business of Spire, the business of Satellogic, just to quote a few. which are actually transparent because they have financial statements available over the internet. When you see those companies, you see that their business is growing very slightly, but never enough to cover their costs, which is clearly a concern. And my impression is that every new player is fighting for the same cake. The cake is not really growing. People buying observation data, but maybe they spend 4 billion a year. That's too much they will spend. So if you put more players, you will have smaller slices for everyone. I don't think that this is actually changing significantly. The key point would be if one of those players eventually comes with a magic solution to actually make money out of that. And that would be a big change. And today, very few players are actually making good money out of this data business. So one of them is Airbus GIS, of course. The other one is Maxar, now an MDA company. I don't know exactly what is the last denomination, but basically it was Digital Globe. And these guys are making money because they have mostly military customers. And this is probably where most of the data is going and where most of the value will come from. So this is what I believe. In terms of broadband and telecom services, we have looked at the situation in the past. Today, the European geo satellite operators, they are faced with a decreasing demand. This is what I said at the beginning. So they will buy less satellites because they don't need that many to actually serve the demand they have. And then we have the new business, which is coming up, which is the direct broadband and maybe the direct to device and direct to cell. For this, we see that Starlink now is capturing most of the market, probably. And they have found new users where others were unable to find. And for the rest, we still need to know. It's not yet a market, it's in infancy. So let's see if this is actually building up. Sorry, that was a bit long.
No, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mark has raised his hand again, or is this the previous one? Mark Vallès again? No, probably not. Is there any other question or comment?
It looks like they are making some revenues in the downstream on the supply chain. So do you have the same analysis if when we are talking of Copernicus?
Well, but Copernicus is a very specific thing because the Copernicus data is free. So there is no way to actually put a value on that. Actually, I believe there would be ways, but this is not what the European Union is pursuing, because I think it's always possible to put a value on a free service, provided that you look at the costs already. And there are many studies which have been promoted by the Union about the added value of this Copernicus data. The main one is called the EU and GNSS market study, which is available on the European Union website. But if you scroll through that, as I did, for me, it's very difficult to actually get a feeling of what is the value added from that specific Copernicus data set. So we don't do it. So I don't have any specific insight. And the people who do it, today I have difficulties in understanding what is produced by them. But maybe it's only me. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but it's difficult to put it in perspective with our data because it's not methodologically correct to do it that way. So Serge has raised his hand again.
Yes, thank you, Pierre. Again, another question is about the trend of FTE, which is quite growing, as you have shown to us, explaining us that it's linked also to the orders, order intake over at least 2023, let's say, the time that the sales could be materialized 1 or 2 years after. Have you some data about the trend of the orders that European industry SMEs has captured in 2023?
No, we wanted to do that 15 years ago when we pushed the survey questionnaire. We did a big methodological update, and we worked with a number of representatives of industry, but they didn't feel comfortable in releasing this information in a systematic way. So what we do, on the other hand, is that we look closely at the quarterly declarations from the big players, and there was a lot of information shared by both the Thales Group and the Airbus Group about their orders and the situation they are foreseeing for space systems market from their own perspective. And basically, both of them, they showed mitigated information. They showed that they had work ahead of them. And if you look at the employment situation, they have been hiring a lot in recent years. On the other hand, they are facing financial and programmatic difficulties. And so they now have announced employment reductions on both sides. So we will see probably those playing out in 2024, 2025. Those employment reductions are never happening overnight. It always takes a while so that enterprises can adapt. So clearly, I don't believe that this FTE growth trend, at least in the large groups, will be furthered in the coming years. That's the only thing I can say. But I know that there is a lot of backlog associated to ESA programs in particular. And so this will eventually unfold, and this business is there.
Okay, thank you, Pierre.
You're welcome. So it's now almost 3:30. I don't know if there is any comment or remark arising anymore. So I think it's time now to close down this presentation. As I said, there is the full presentation will be available for download from our website. The post has been programmed for 4 o'clock, so it will be there on 4 o'clock. The people who have registered for this event will also receive an email from Charles, most probably, and he will be sharing the link so you can download the presentation. It will not be sent directly by email because I think the PDF file is slightly too big for everyone to handle. So this will be the way we will proceed. So again, I would like to first expend my great gratitude to the members of Eurospace, which are funding this work every year. Of course, to the people who participate in the survey, which they do an essential contribution to our understanding of the economics, and also to the Eurospace team, which is supporting me with all those data assessment, data analysis, data gathering. This is really very much a collective achievement, and I'm only the person presenting it, and of course, taking the responsibility of facing you with all those elements and facts. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming here today, and I wish you a great end of the week, especially that we are so happy that Ariane 6 was a success yesterday. Clearly, this has been a big achievement for the sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre.
Thank you, Pierre. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Faut que tu fasses stop avant, je pense, sur l'enregistrement.
Bye.